Fighting games feature something that has given its genre and its competitive scene one of the biggest and strongest foundations in all organized esports: the power of local grassroots and professional events. You might feel like your regional weekly bracket, played at someone's house, or maybe a small venue, are fairly insignificant in comparison to EVO. But the reality is, the ecosystem is strong because of these smaller community-run events. Furthermore, the super major events we see today with thousands of players involved, publishers shipping demos of upcoming titles, and broadcasting to multiple languages live, were once nothing more than a table with a couple of CRT monitors or a small arcade looking to earn a few extra quarters with in-house events. In today's DashFight video, we want to tell you how it is that the current state of fighting games events came to be through the past 3 decades, how developers started integrating into them, and why the ecosystem remains one of the strongest ones, even where elsewhere publishers push out entire franchise leagues for their titles. Like in most regions, the start of the fighting games competitive scene as we know it starts with the arcades. These were available worldwide, but there was a strong core in the Asian communities, especially those throughout Southeast Asia, where it remained strong for decades after its collapse in most of the Western Hemisphere. Japan's size is also a perfect setup for generational talent. Its highly urbanized cities, as well as its technological boom in the 80s and 90s, meant that there were a lot of opportunities for players to engage with fighting game arcades. With so many of the genre's developers based in Japan, it's a no-brainer that a scene quickly flourished. This environment was bound to produce the first major competitive player, and all it took was igniting the passion of a young Daigo to set the stage for the first of many critical moments in the history of the FGC. In 1998, Daigo would play in the United States for the first time and faced off against another iconic figure, Alex Valle. That would mark the beginning of a long-lasting friendly rivalry between the United States and Japan across a wide variety of fighting games, one that we still see today. What's most impressive about the Japanese competitive scene is that by the time we saw these international matches, they already had a well-established culture for tournaments that grew over a decade in the arcades. One that continues to this day and still produces incredible talent alongside the many more in consoles and sometimes on PC. While Japan built its tight tournament community, something different happened in the United States. Arcades were still popular in the region, but they never took off at the same speed as Japan because of economic and cultural differences. Still, there were a lot of tournaments that happened during the arcade era, perhaps the most prestigious of which is EVO, which started as a California-based tournament that would eventually move out of its Cali Coast roots and would go on to have perhaps one of the most successful streaks in fighting game history. All throughout the early 2000s, it was impossible to deny that EVO captivated the eyes and ears of people worldwide in a way virtually no other event could. As consoles became increasingly popular during the early 2000s, it also became a lot easier to host a local event at smaller venues. You didn't need a full arcade to host a fighting game tournament. You could do that in your home by just bringing a couple of consoles together, maybe rent a CRT or two from a local electronics store, and suddenly you could have a tournament. Over time, the idea of renting venues inside hotels, for example, became attainable. Although these smaller events weren't EVO size, they are still a huge part of the FGC's history and culture as one of the primary ways that people engage with this community. They are not just for the competitive players, but to develop a sense of local identity. A great example of this idea of locality continuing today is the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate community, which has an extensive range of rankings not just for international or national levels of competition, but down to a state level. This means that when you go to a tournament in another state, there is a good chance someone from your home state will go there as well and will cheer you on. And that's a level of collective identity that other competitive scenes try very hard to replicate. For the FGC, supporting your local player or a player from the same nationality is ingrained in the culture. Changing gears for a second, we also want to tell you about esports. Starting in 2010 and lasting until about 2018 is a period that can be best summarized as venture capital funding finding its way into the esports community. This is a time when big moves were happening in the competitive side of multiple games, from Call of Duty to Halo to League of Legends, Dota, Overwatch, and numerous other games. Compared to those other titles, the fighting game community was a lot more stringent on what it was willing to put up with in the give and take with investors, and this wasn't entirely unfounded. The community had already been burnt with MLG's handling of EVO in 2005, and it wasn't quick to forget it. There was also the aspect that a lot of the big sponsorship money was coming in from peripheral vendors, and only some of them were selling or even designing peripherals with fighting game players in mind. It would take a couple more years for us to see some more commercial investments into, for example, fight sticks, which were and still are more custom, artisan made. What investment did get into the fighting game scene was usually through deals with teams that would sign the top players in a competitive community and then provide them with sponsorship opportunities and, ideally, pay for their travel and registration fees for major events. By the tail end of the Big E esports era, we were already starting to see some of the failings of that rapid expansion in the esports industry. Some of the investments were not outputting the numbers they were supposed to. With investment drying up and revenue not catching up to maintain the enormous sizes it enabled, something had to come down. This slow, at first, spiral of despair did not have the same massive effect on fighting games as it did in other sectors. One key reason for this was that the primary way people engaged with the community was through more grassroots, directly supported efforts in local and regional events, mostly kept afloat thanks to player participation and endemic local sponsors. During these pre-pandemic years, many companies realized the potential of being part of the fighting game community. Instead of approaching it from the side of complete ownership, they would try to integrate themselves into a larger scope of the scene. Red Bull Gaming and We Play Studios are examples of well-established major tournament organizing companies willing to play by the fighting game rules. They had invitational tournaments as opposed to the more traditional open tournaments. Still, both celebrated fighting games and were willing to be a part of the larger pool of tournaments instead of trying to take it all over for themselves. Sadly, it will remain an interesting late 2010 what-if scenario, where companies and major tournament organizers join together and have high-stakes competitive tournaments alongside the open, traditional community-based tournaments. That is not to say that's not happening in 2023, but the global recession, the pandemic, and other external factors have certainly made it a lot more difficult to justify that type of investment today than it was back in 2018. So far, we've talked about what makes the fighting game community tournaments enduring now. Sadly, it's time to talk about the one thing that truly threatens that strong culture. There's a lot to touch on here. One of the only positives of these years was the opportunity to introduce new players to many games. People who might have enjoyed games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, or Tekken in the past now had the time to check out the latest iteration of these franchises, and a good number of them fell back in love with the titles. On the other side, there was everything else. Tournament organizers were shocked by the news of the lockdowns. It meant that one of the ways the community supported each other was cut. In the first few weeks of the lockdowns, it became apparent that the tournaments would have to be suspended or entirely canceled. Although this might seem as simple as calling the hotel or the venue and canceling the event, the reality is that those venues and events were owed the renting fees in most cases. This is especially true in a situation where they weren't going to be getting any more from any other event to replace it. All events were canceled. It led to multiple cases of tournament organizers paying upwards of thousands of dollars for cancellation fees, including returning the money to those who had bought a ticket or paid the registration fees prior to cancellations. Another major issue with online play for the competitive scene was its poor quality. Today, we can say that most games have a functional online architecture, thanks to the community's efforts to bring rollback netcode to as many games as possible. But that was not the case when the pandemic first hit, leading to lower quality connections and a major point of tension among pro players. It was the first time in over 2 decades that fighting games competitions could not be held in an offline venue, becoming one of the most challenging times for the entire scene. But suppose you expand your scope to the rest of the esports industry. With that in mind, the community came through scarred, but not down. The community has something that allows them to sustain themselves even in the most challenging circumstances. The community was banding together and helping tournament organizers, players, and entire teams make it possible for the community to come out of the pandemic safe and still growing. The availability of streaming, combined with a strong sense of community, allows some organizers to move their events online, at least temporarily, sustaining the scene during the lockdowns. Alongside the community celebrating the return of offline events, something else came back in force. publisher-led professional circuits. These existed for years, but over the past decade, they have grown and shown the power of compromising on control when it comes to such a heavily community-led scene. The Tekken World Tour, Capcom Cup, Dragon Ball FighterZ World Tour, Brawlhalla Esports Circuit, and more are all different ways for developers and publishers to insert themselves at the center of the competitive community and focus that passion back into the game itself. Not all of these circuits are the same. Some are more freeform, like the Tekken World Tour, which allows tournament organizers to submit their events and provides major tournaments with more points to distribute to competing players. Others, like Capcom Cup, organize their own sets of qualifiers, but do so to give players of various regions opportunities to qualify for the finals. You might also look at circuits created almost entirely by the publisher or developer, such as Brawlhalla, which lays out the entire esports season each year with its key events directly produced in-house. Finally, some communities may even choose to host unofficial circuits. A well-known case of this was the Smash World Tour, which had, to put it lightly, no support from Nintendo. All of these approaches have pros and cons, and ultimately, they provide a sense of continuity between major and minor events in their respective competitive scenes. Sadly, not all has been good news for the FGC. As we mentioned before, the economic boom of previous years was starting to reel back after revenues lagged behind projections. With the pandemic striking the final blow, it was only a matter of time before major production houses, organizations, and especially teams started to close their doors and heavily shift their priorities. It all led to cases like Beyond the Summit, a prominent tournament organizer dissolving, or Panda, which became the center of a controversy in late 2022 regarding the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate scene, which was dissolved following many prominent members stepping out of the team. Other teams simply focused their attention away from the FGC, such as Team Liquid, which offloaded all their fighting game players in 2021. Things are looking up for the community. The next generation of mainstream fighting games are here, or just around the corner, and the first to land, Street Fighter 6, has scored highly for many. If Tekken 8 and Mortal Kombat 1 can do the same, the solid community-based foundation will allow its competitive scenes to flourish further.